G'day, and thank you for joining me today on Essays from a Strange Country. I'm your host, writer, and producer, Jasmine Wolfe. Each episode explores Australia through the stories we tell and the culture we create. Through literature, film, art, and music, I'll examine the people, ideas, myths, and contradictions that shape Australia and our understanding of ourselves. So settle in and let's begin. Aboriginal Gothic begins as a refusal of a convenient inheritance. The European Gothic arrived in Australia with its familiar machinery of haunted houses, ancestral crimes, spectral returns, and threatened innocence. But on this continent, those conventions could not remain merely decorative. Transplanted onto stolen land, the Gothic's old anxieties about inheritance, legitimacy, and buried violence acquired a sharper historical charge. What had often functioned as a silencing discourse within colonial writing, casting Indigenous presence as primitive, uncanny, vanishing, or monstrous, becomes in Aboriginal Gothic a means of writing back to empire. The genre turns the settler's own imaginative apparatus against him. This reversal has deep historical roots. Australian Gothic emerges at the plate margins of European literary form and frontier violence, where 18th century fears of ruins, savagery, and moral corruption collided with invasion, massacre, dispossession, and the Black War. The settler colonial imagination required a paradox. It needed the continent to be empty enough to possess, yet threatening enough to conquer. Terra nullius therefore depended not only on legal fiction but on atmosphere. The bush as hostile void, Aboriginal people as spectral impediment, settlement as heroic endurance. Such stories made expansion appear both inevitable and virtuous, which is to say they made violence look like civilization. Aboriginal Gothic exposes the instability of that arrangement. It suggests that many of the qualities Australians have been taught to admire, mateship, larrikin resilience, the taming of the bush, may operate as psychological screens, obscuring the more abrasive facts of land theft, racial terror, and genocide. The unease is not incidental, it is structural. A nation founded on the denial of prior sovereignty must continually manage the suspicion that its home is not securely its own. Through the inversion of the monster and the collapse of linear time, Aboriginal Gothic reveals contemporary Australian identity as marked by profound unease over belonging. Its most disturbing proposition is not that the landscape is haunted, but that country remembers. Not that Aboriginal presence is uncanny, but that the civilizing state may itself be the predator. Indigenous Gothic reveals one of the more anxious reversals in Australian cultural life. The possibility that the figure calling itself civilized is in fact the monstrous intruder. This is not simply a change in moral sympathy, with Aboriginal characters made innocent and Europeans made villainous. It is a deeper cosmological inversion. The Gothic machinery inherited from Europe, ghosts, curses, uncanny landscapes, demonic presences, had long assisted colonial writing in casting Indigenous people as primitive, spectral, violent, or doomed. Aboriginal Gothic turns that apparatus back upon the settler. The monster is no longer the Aboriginal figure imagined at the edge of the campfire. It is the colonizer who arrives uninvited, consumes country, breaks law, and mistakes his own predation for progress. Mudruru's novel, Dr. Wireddy's Prescription for Enduring the Ending of the World, makes this reversal especially clear through its description of the British as numb ghosts. The term does more than mark their physical pallor or strangeness. It relocates the invaders inside an Aboriginal metaphysical order, where they appear not as agents of reason, history, and civilization, but as deathly apparitions moving across country without proper relation to land, kinship, or law. From Wuridi's perspective, British arrival is not settlement in any stable moral sense. It is a haunting. The newcomers are uncanny because they behave as beings severed from the living obligations that make human existence intelligible. This cosmological judgment is sharpened through the figure of Ria Warawa. In Dr. Wuridi initially associates the British sailing ships with the domain of this evil spirit, and he increasingly understands the invaders as manifestations of its destructive force. The significance of this is formal as well as thematic. Mudruru does not merely insert Aboriginal characters into a European Gothic structure, he allows Aboriginal cosmology to interpret European history. The British are not the neutral observers who classify Indigenous belief. They are themselves classified, judged, and rendered strange. The imperial gaze is returned with interest. Sam Watson's The Kadaitcha Song develops a related inversion, though through different figures and emphasis. Its primary antagonist is not Ria Warawa, but the sorcerer Buka, whose presence belongs to Watson's own apocalyptic structure of vengeance, violation, and spiritual contest. Within that world, white people are described as mindless brutes, driven by an evil sort of hunger. The phrase is blunt, but not crude. Hunger names the colonial appetite for land, minerals, labour, children, stories, and futurity itself. Watson's Gothic does not exaggerate colonisation into monstrosity, rather it finds a form adequate to a historical violence that ordinary realism can too easily make look like administration. The historical target of this inversion is the 19th century colonial binary that cast Aboriginal people as the monstrous other. Frontier rhetoric repeatedly framed Indigenous resistance as savagery, thereby making military reprisal, exile, confinement, and dispossession appear regrettable but necessary. Such Manichaean logic was politically useful because civilization required its opposite. Aboriginal Gothic disorganizes that structure by exposing it as projection. The savagery attributed to Aboriginal people returns as the disavowed truth of colonization itself. There remains, however, a danger in any Gothic treatment of Indigenous history. If handled carelessly, Aboriginal figures can again become symbolic instruments for white anxiety, avenging spirits, brooding presences, or convenient embodiments of settler guilt. The strongest Aboriginal Gothic avoids this by grounding terror not in settler psychology but in Indigenous sovereignty. Its ghosts and spirits are not decorative darkness. They signal that country has not consented, history has not passed, and the colonizers' claim to normality remains a nervous performance. Australians fear, or have been taught to fear, a land that remembers. The settler imaginary has long depended upon a contrary fiction, that the bush is empty, hostile, illegible, and morally mute. Such emptiness is not a property of the land itself, but an achievement of perception, a careful blindness of eye that enables occupation to appear as discovery and possession as endurance. The Gothic pressure in Aboriginal and post-Mabo works arises precisely when this blindness fails. Country does not remain backdrop, it looks back. Warwick Thornton's Sweet Country is crucial here because it refuses the old pictorial habit of treating the outback as either sublime wilderness or scenic national credential. Its landscape is not merely harsh terrain against which human dramas unfold, it is a character, or more exactly a sovereign presence, dense with law, memory, and consequence. The settler figures move through it as though it were empty space awaiting their commands, a stage for policing, punishment, property, and rough justice. Yet the film repeatedly exposes this as white fella misunderstanding. The land is not vacant. It is structured by a deep and complex web of ancient laws that colonial authority neither recognizes nor escapes. This matters formally. Thornton's cinematography gives the landscape a material agency that unsettles the viewer's expectation of mastery. The use of visual shimmer, including ultraviolet effects, does not simply beautify the desert, it makes country appear excessive, unstable, and alive beyond the limits of settler perception. Light becomes less a medium of revelation than a sign that something remains unassimilated. The frame cannot quite contain what it shows. In this respect, the film disrupts the inherited Burken or Kantian sublime, in which vast landscapes enlarge the human subject by staging nature as an object to be feared, contemplated, and finally mastered. In Sweet Country, the land does not elevate the settler mind. It diminishes its pretensions. The result is a decisive reversal of the colonial Gothic. In older settler writing, the bush often functions as an atopic void, a placeless place, threatening because it appears without history, shelter, or intelligible meaning. This void licenses fear while concealing its source. The settler is not terrified because the land is empty, but because it is not empty enough. It contains prior claims, violated relations, and memories that refuse the convenience of disappearance. Aboriginal Gothic turns the supposed blankness of landscape into evidence against the fantasy of settlement. What had been imagined as wilderness becomes witness. The historical significance of this shift is sharpened after Mabo. Native title unsettled more than property law. It disturbed a national metaphysics. If land could be legally recognized as already inhabited, already named, already governed by continuing relation, then the settler home became uncannily less settled. Post-Mabo cinema and literature repeatedly returned to this disturbance. The homestead, the station, the road, the fence line, and the desert horizon no longer signify hard-won belonging. They become fragile inscriptions laid over older sovereignties. The Gothic emerges from this doubleness. The settler sees home, but the narrative allows country to disclose occupation. There is, however, a necessary complication. The same landscapes that Aboriginal Gothic reanimates as sovereign and historical are also readily absorbed into a touristic gaze. The outback remains commercially useful as a nationally representative image: red earth, empty horizon, spiritualized distance, all available for consumption. Even gestures towards Indigenous meaning can be repackaged as atmosphere, lending depth to a marketable landscape without disturbing the structures that profit from it. The danger is not that country lacks power, but that settler culture is highly practiced at turning disturbance into scenery. Aboriginal Gothic resists that conversion by insisting that landscape is not a symbol of national identity. It is the ground on which national identity stands accused. Indigenous Gothic unsettles one of settler Australia's most useful consolations, the belief that colonial violence belongs to a completed past. National progress depends upon a tidy temporal sequence: discovery, settlement, hardship, development, reconciliation, in which each stage supersedes the last. Aboriginal Gothic refuses that sequence. It presents colonisation not as an origin story safely sealed behind the archive, but as a recurring structure of occupation, surveillance, removal, and denial. In this mode, 1788 is not a date so much as a condition. The past does not return because it has never properly departed. Sam Watson's The Kardaicha Sung makes this temporal disturbance explicit. Its narrative compresses 100,000 white men's years into a single 2-day present, a formal maneuver that refuses the settler scale of historical measurement. The phrase itself is barbed. White men's years implies that European chronology is not neutral time, but a cultural instrument, one that measures possession, law, progress, and inheritance according to the occupier's clock. Against that clock, Watson sets a deeper Indigenous temporality in which ancestral presence, contemporary political violence, and future retribution coexist. The effect is not simply mythic, it is historical in a sharper sense. It suggests that colonial trauma remains unfinished because the conditions that produced it remain active. This collapse of time is central to the Gothic force of the text. The Gothic usually depends upon the past erupting into the present, a buried crime, a hereditary curse, a ruined house that will not stay ornamental. Watson relocates that structure to the settler colony, where the buried crime is not private but national. The horror lies in the recognition that the social order calling itself modern has been built upon an older violence it cannot metabolize. The result is a volatile present in which law and terror, bureaucracy and haunting, modern policing and frontier reprisal no longer appear as separate historical phases. They are variations of the same colonial grammar. Rolf de Heer's The Tracker similarly breaks the comfort of linear historical absorption. Its use of paintings interrupts the forward movement of the chase, halting the viewer before images of brutality rather than allowing violence to dissolve into narrative momentum. These visual interludes function less as illustration than as accusation. They deny the spectator the passive pleasures of period drama, where historical cruelty can be consumed as atmosphere. By arresting time, the paintings insist that frontier violence is not merely something being represented, it is something being repeated, aestheticized, remembered, and disavowed at once. The film's temporal disruptions, including subjective flash-forward intrusions, also disturb the authority of settler perspective. The chase narrative usually belongs to the colonial state: pursuit, capture, punishment, order restored. Yet the tracker fractures that logic. Time no longer serves the policeman's authority or the law's linear progress toward resolution. Instead, the structure exposes the ritual quality of colonial violence, its grim circularity. The frontier appears not as an early stage of the nation, but as one of its recurring methods. This formal resistance has clear historical force in the context of the history wars, where frontier violence was repeatedly contested as either foundational trauma or exaggerated grievance. The insistence that massacres, dispossession, and child removal should be treated as a matter of history depends upon a deceptively simple operation, placing violence at a distance. Indigenous Gothic refuses that distance. It shows that what is called history continues materially. In land ownership, incarceration, poverty, policing, memorial silence, and the management of national feeling. Yet this temporal politics is not uniform. Kim Scott's taboo complicates the Gothic pattern of return by turning from revenge toward a more difficult and uncertain practice of repair. The novel does not erase massacre or historical violation, nor does it offer reconciliation as a clean national solvent. Rather, its return to a damaged site is structured around restoration, fragile encounter, and the possibility of renewed relation. This creates a productive tension within Aboriginal Gothic. Watson's work emphasizes the rage of unfinished violation. Scott's imagines the more precarious labor of living after catastrophe without pretending catastrophe has passed. Between these positions lies the genre's central pressure. the past must be confronted as present, but not every return need become revenge. National amnesia fails not because memory is sentimental, but because country, story, and survival keep exposing the falseness of closure. The figure of the lost child occupies a peculiar place in the Australian settler imagination. In its most familiar form, it is the white child swallowed by the bush, innocent, vulnerable, imperiled by a landscape imagined as trackless, hostile, and unknowable. Yet this myth functions as a profound psychological screen. It displaces attention from the children who are not lost by accident but taken by policy, bureaucracy, police, mission managers, and welfare boards. Aboriginal Gothic reconfigures the lost child motif by exposing its racial asymmetry. Settler culture mourns the white child who vanishes into country, while rendering less visible the Aboriginal child removed from country, kin, language, and law. Rachel Perkins's One Night the Moon offers a pointed revision of this myth. The disappearance of the white child is not simply a bush tragedy, nor a fable about nature's indifference. It is the consequence of Jim Ryan's racial arrogance. When Albert, the Aboriginal tracker, offers his knowledge of country, Jim refuses him. "No blacks on my land." The phrase is almost comically possessive, where its consequences not so bleak. Jim claims ownership over land he cannot read, rejects the man who can read it, and thereby helps seal his daughter's fate. The lost white child becomes a figure not of settler innocence, but of settler self-destruction. The bush does not maliciously devour the child. Rather, the father's fantasy of mastery renders him blind within it. The film's Gothic force lies in this inversion. The danger does not emanate from Aboriginal presence, as older colonial melodramas so often implied, but from the settlers' refusal to acknowledge Aboriginal knowledge. Albert is framed not as uncanny intruder, but as the one figure capable of restoring relation between human movement and landscape. Jim's whiteness, by contrast, becomes a form of perceptual disability. His authority depends on excluding Aboriginal presence, yet that exclusion produces catastrophe. The Gothic here is not a supernatural eruption, but the return of what settler sovereignty has tried to suppress. The fact that country is not empty and never has been. The film's visual grammar deepens this critique through its repeated use of thresholds, windows, and framed interiors. The window becomes more than a domestic aperture. It is a device for staging selective vision. Settler interiors look outward onto land they claim but do not understand, while Aboriginal loss is held at the margins of the frame, visible yet structurally disavowed. This frame within the frame suggests a broader national habit. The settler household organises its emotional life around the endangered white child while keeping Indigenous dispossession just outside the field of sanctioned grief. The Gothic pressure comes from the instability of that boundary. What has been excluded from the domestic scene returns as accusation, not through rhetoric but through composition, silence, and failed sight. Historically, this revision is inseparable from the stolen generations. The sentimental power of the lost child narrative depends on imagining disappearance as exceptional. A sudden accident, a rupture in family life, a wound inflicted by an alien landscape. For Aboriginal families, removal was not exceptional in this sense. It was administrative, repeated, and intimate, a violence made ordinary by files, uniforms, vehicles, dormitories, and the cold language of protection. Aboriginal Gothic therefore shifts vanishing away from the supposed natural menace of the bush and towards the active predatory violence of the state. The true horror is not that children may be lost in country, but that children were deliberately severed from it. This is why the continuing cultural fascination with texts such as Picnic at Hanging Rock remains so revealing. Its vanished schoolgirls are often read as escaping the constraints of Victorian femininity, dissolving into a landscape charged with erotic and metaphysical mystery. Yet the Aboriginal histories of such sites are usually treated as atmospheric residue, if acknowledged at all. White vanishing becomes aesthetic, even desirable. Aboriginal vanishing remains historical, political, and inconvenient. The Aboriginal Gothic corrects this imbalance by asking whose disappearance is mourned, whose is romanticized, and whose was organized by the state with a clean conscience and a paper trail. Samuel Wagan Watson's Parallel Oz relocates the Gothic from the distant frontier to the mapped, zoned, and asphalted city. Its anxiety is not produced by ruined castles or empty bushland, but by the ordinary violence of streets, subdivisions, development corridors, and civic forgetting. The poem's Yellow Brick Road is not a path of childish enchantment or national promise. It is pockmarked with massacre sites. The allusion to Oz is pointedly ironic. A fantasy route associated with arrival, transformation, and homecoming becomes, in Watson's hands, a road laid across suppressed histories. The urban landscape is therefore not clean, modern, or safely post-frontier. It is a ghosted entity, animated by what municipal order has tried to bury beneath infrastructure. The force of the poem lies partly in its refusal to let urban space appear innocent. Australian cities often narrate themselves as departures from the violence of the frontier, cosmopolitan, developed, administratively rational, and apparently detached from the colonial struggle over land. Watson's geography unsettles that comforting division. Brisbane, Melbourne, and other post-Federation centres were not built after dispossession had ended. They were built through dispossession and then furnished with the language of improvement. Streets and suburbs become instruments of forgetting, their names and property lines converting country into real estate. The Gothic pressure emerges from this contradiction. The city presents itself as orderly while resting on an unacknowledged disorder. Its cleanliness is not moral clarity but successful laundering. The prose poem's form intensifies this critique. Unlike lyric verse arranged through line breaks and white space, Parallel Oz appears as a tight visual block, a compacted field of language that denies the reader easy passage. This is not merely a stylistic preference. The absence of lineation produces a squeezed breathlessness, making reading itself feel spatially constrained. The poem's form mimics the forced subdivision of land, bounded, compressed, partitioned, deprived of open continuity. Where colonial mapping divided country into parcels capable of sale, inheritance, and surveillance, Watson's prose block turns the page into a pressure chamber. The reader encounters dispossession not only as subject matter but as spatial experience. This formal claustrophobia also resists the picturesque habits through which Australian landscapes are commonly consumed. The poem does not offer the city as panorama, heritage precinct, or multicultural postcard, nor does it allow the reader to stand at a safe aesthetic distance from violence. Its density produces proximity. The massacre site is not elsewhere, not beyond the city limits, not quarantined in a remote past. It lies underfoot, embedded in the roots of daily movement. In this sense, Watson's Gothic is less about supernatural visitation than historical congestion. Too much has been pushed beneath the surface, and the surface can no longer hold. Yet this geography of unbelonging is not exclusively Aboriginal, even if Aboriginal sovereignty and dispossession remain its governing wound. Gothic forms have also been used by migrant writers to register non-Anglo-Celtic experiences of devaluation, estrangement, and civic invisibility. This complicates any simple account of the city as divided only between settler and Indigenous presence. The Australian urban Gothic is hybrid because the city itself is layered: invaded country, colonial grid, migrant suburb, speculative development, memorial silence. Still, Watson's work keeps the deeper structure in view. Other forms of unbelonging occur on land already made unstable by the original theft. The prose poem becomes a cramped map of that condition. Modern Australia as a place forever subdividing space, while failing to divide itself from what happened there. The Aboriginal Gothic reveals a national culture less settled than its official vocabularies permit. Beneath the confident language of settlement, progress, mateship, and possession lies a more anxious recognition that the country imagined as empty was never empty, that the wilderness cast as hostile was already lawful country, and that the figure most at home in the Gothic is not the Aboriginal savage of colonial fantasy, but the settler intruder, spectral, hungry, and uncertain of his own legitimacy. Across these works, monstrosity is relocated from Indigenous presence to colonial occupation itself. The land is not a blank stage for national becoming, but a sovereign witness, carrying memory where law and history have often preferred amnesia. Time, too, refuses to behave. Frontier violence cannot be sealed safely in the past when its consequences remain materially present in dispossession, removal, policing, and the uneasy architecture of Australian belonging. The lost child, the haunted road, the shimmering desert, the subdivided suburb. Each becomes a sign of a culture sensing but trying not to see the conditions of its own inheritance. This is why the Gothic persists with such force in Australian cultural expression. It gives form to what liberal national narratives struggle to admit, that the nation's future was imagined over an immense historical crime scene, and that its most cherished myths often operate as screens against that knowledge. The result is not merely guilt, nor a simple demand for confession, but a deeper condition of cultural ill health, an aspirational identity shadowed by the fear of existential homelessness. Aboriginal Gothic therefore does more than revise a European genre. It exposes the colonial foundations of Australian self-imagining and returns sovereignty, memory, and terror to country. In an unceded continent, the Gothic is not an ornamental darkness added to national life. It is the mode through which the nation's buried realities continue to speak. That's all for this episode of Essays from a Strange Country. I'm Jasmine Wolfe, and you've been listening to a small attempt to make sense of Australian identity through the things we create when we're not busy avoiding the question entirely. Film, literature, art and music give us more than cultural decoration. They give us evidence. If today's episode has left you with a firmer answer about what Australia is, I'm afraid something has gone wrong. The point is not to solve the country. The point is to notice how often it contradicts itself and how revealing those contradictions can be. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe, share it, or mention it vaguely to someone at a barbecue before the conversation collapses into real estate. Until next time, keep reading the margins, watching the background, and listening for what the culture tries not to say.